Well, hey there, folks. Welcome to the Roundup. We're a Cowboy State Daily podcast, and our focus is on interesting people in the Cowboy State. Today, what an interesting person with an amazing career. And we're able to celebrate the career of this gentleman here on our podcast today. First, though, I want to make sure that you all know about the Wyoming Business Alliance Business from the Basement podcast. It is a fantastic resource for anybody who is a business person here in Wyoming. If you have any questions, if you've got ideas, if you've got issues, stop by, take a listen to the Business from the Basement podcast. They're just a great resource there at the Wyoming Business Alliance. So check them out. But first, you want to check this out. You want to check us out here on the Roundup because we're talking today to Brian Nesvik. Brian just wrapped up a 30-year career in the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. On top of that, he's also been a career National Guardsman. And so we get to talk to him about being a part of both of these really important organizations here in Wyoming. And I just have to say, welcome, Brian, and congratulations on your retirement. I hear it's going well.
It is, Wendy, and thank you for the opportunity to come and visit with you here today.
Well, we are thrilled to have you on. And Brian, I want to tell people you're coming to us from Glendo, Wyoming, and there's not a whole lot of people that are there in Glendo. So you get to celebrate and really be a part of that. This is a place that's important to your family history. Tell us about your place there in Glendo.
Yeah, so my wife grew up on her longtime family ranch here just west of Glendo. It's been in the family for over 100 years, and we had the fortune to be able to come here and start our own ranching operation here a little over a year ago, and so that's what we do just here west of Glendo. It's a great place to be.
So you went from managing wild animals to managing tame animals. What's your operation there?
Yeah, so we have a cow-calf operation. And there's an opportunity to like really all ranchers in Wyoming, you have an opportunity to manage your land for both wildlife and for domestic animal production. And we certainly do that here and have a tremendous value for wildlife and provide a lot of wildlife habitat.
Wow. So you get to continue the work that you started 30 years ago. Oh, let's go back real quickly. Let's go back 30 years. And you saying, I think I want to become a game warden for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. Tell us about that decision. Where were you at in your life where you said, because you were already in the National Guard by then, right?
Yeah, actually, I had made this decision when I was a 14-year-old kid that this is what I wanted to do. So that was before I joined the Guard, but I actually wanted to join the Guard then too. My dad served and my grandfather served in World War II, and so I always had that desire to be able to serve in multiple ways. But I was always fascinated with the outdoors and with wildlife. And I never forget it. I was in Deer Creek Park south of Casper, Wyoming when I was 14. I was on my first deer hunt. At that time, you had to be 14. It's 12, but at that time you had to be 14 in order to hunt big game. And it was my first hunt, and I was with my father and one of his longtime friends, and we had interaction with a game warden. And I listened to him talk to my father and his friend about what his day looked like and about, his office, which was the outdoors, and his pickup truck. And I left that conversation that day and I said, you know what, I want to be a Wyoming game warden. And I focused on that.
So that was your goal from then on. Tell us then about your path to get there. What did you go to college? What was your path there?
Yeah, so I went to the University of Wyoming and earned a degree in wildlife and fisheries biology and management. And then when I graduated, actually at that time they only offered the game warden exam every other year because there just weren't that many openings. And so I had to wait a year. I went to work as a deputy sheriff in Albany County, and then took the game warden exam and was offered a job as basically a trainee, and started out as a game warden and then worked all over the state as a game warden and worked my way up through the ranks.
Now, you went and you got your degree in biology, in wildlife biology. Tell us about the difficulties you had. My understanding is that you mentioned it, you just referenced it, the fact that there weren't that many openings. It was really a difficult thing to be able to get into the Game and Fish Department at that time. That changed over time. Tell us about that.
It really did. So when I went the first time to go take that exam, I walked into the auditorium at the Wyoming Department of Transportation in Cheyenne, and there were hundreds of people in there taking the test, and they were planning to hire 10 seasonal employees out of those hundreds of people. And so it was very competitive. I was very fortunate and got offered a job after that experience, but then you really had to keep competing for your job each year until you got a permanent game warden district. And at that time, it took from the time I was first hired till there was an opening, it was 3 years before a game warden retired. And then I was fortunate enough to get that first opening that came, and yeah, I was went to the law enforcement academy during that time, and and then started out as in my very first game warden district in Elk Mountain, Wyoming.
How did that experience going to law enforcement academy, how did that then serve you later on in your career as a game warden?
Well, I think as most folks know in Wyoming, game wardens about a third of their responsibility, a third of their time is law enforcement and making sure that folks follow all the wildlife laws and regulations. And then in Wyoming, we have game wardens have the responsibility for boating law enforcement as well. And so it's certainly a critical part of your training in order to be well suited and to be good at enforcing Wyoming laws to go to the law enforcement academy. Game wardens in Wyoming are certified peace officers, and so it's a necessary requirement.
That's so interesting. I don't know that very many people know that. And so I think that that's fascinating. How long were you in the Game and Fish Department as a warden before before you chose to change the angle in which you served in that department?
Yeah, so I served as a warden in Elk Mountain and then Pinedale, and then I went to Cody as a supervisor. And at that point in time, I was in about 15 years into my career, and the chief game warden at that time had been in that position for 22 years, and the one before him was 18 years. And that job came open when Governor Meade was elected, and I had the opportunity again to compete for that job. And I thought, you know what, I loved where I was at in Cody, but I thought this might be the only chance I have to do it. And so I threw my name in the hat and I got selected to be the chief game warden. And that's when I moved to Cheyenne and really shifted from field work to more policy and Cheyenne headquarters kind of work.
Did you regret that? Because I mean, that means that takes you out of that great outdoors and puts you behind a desk. Is that something that at the time you thought, this is worth it. I can do this, and this is for the good of everybody?
Yeah, and I had it, it was a hard decision because I was in my dream area of Cody, and I loved working in the field and being outside. But I also, I really enjoyed, and I had opportunities through the military to lead and to have, an impact at a bigger scale. I love my state. I thought, this is an opportunity to really influence wildlife management at a bigger scale, and so I don't regret the decision at all. Um, it was difficult though to leave the field and go into more of the policy world.
I remember when you were in Cody, and I was thinking when you left there, I'm like, oh no, he was doing such a great job for us up here. Well, we're thrilled that you had gone and changed that and had felt the calling to do that, because administration really is a calling. It's
It
something that you
is.
have to feel like there is an overarching purpose for what you do. And so looking back then, now that you're there, you're in Cheyenne, you're making these changes with policy. When you got that big job, when you got the head of the game and fish department, not only do you have an impact, but you also have a big target's the wrong word, but you get to deal with all of the good and the bad and all of the things that happen. And you've had quite a few of those challenges in your roles. I mean, the most public one that I can think of right now, of course, is Cody Roberts and all of that. And you had to deal with the fallout of that along with so many other things. Tell us about some of the really big issues that you dealt with while you were the head of the Game and Fish Department.
Yeah, so certainly everything around the Endangered Species Act and wolf and grizzly bear management and the pull and push between federal and state management, that that was one of my biggest challenges and frustrations at times. We really had the opportunity to play out though and show success with wolf reintroduction and management because now, wolves have been delisted. I was a big part of that. Wolves being delisted and falling under state management. And now the wolf population in Wyoming is doing well. It exceeds the minimum recovery criteria set by the federal government and it's going very well. And then on the converse of that, you have the grizzly bear issue where they're by all accounts and measures they are fully biologically recovered, but it has been quite the challenge to get those critters back into where I think they belong under the management of the state, so that the state can manage them just like they do gray wolves.
And you were actually in the Game and Fish Department as part of it, just a game warden, when the wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone. Is that correct? Do I have my timing on that correct?
Yeah, just at the very beginning. So the year I started is the year they were reintroduced. The first group was reintroduced in Yellowstone. So yeah, I got to see it play out, the whole thing play out, and I remember all the controversy around how they went about reintroducing them into the state, and then watched as the population grew and there became conflicts, and um, so it was really interesting to watch that play out and then find success in the end. That was a rewarding part of it.
It's the long game. It really is the long game, which when you are in administration, as you were, that's kind of what you're playing, right? Is the long game for not just those predatory species, but also for the other species under your management.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything, things that you do today for wildlife management, oftentimes you don't see the effect of that decision for decades. I think of habitat work. We spend a lot of time and money on improving and enhancing habitats, and you oftentimes don't see that manifest itself in um, productive wildlife habitat for decades. So it is the long game
That's
for sure.
It is the long game. So let's shift our focus away from those really exciting carnivores, the grizzly
Mm-hmm.
bears and the wolves, and talk about the things that you're also trying to do, which is manage species like deer and elk and antelope and things like that. I think particularly about a couple of winters ago when we had that terrible, terrible winter kill. How did that affect you and your job and the way that you managed wildlife for the next couple of years?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you the challenging part of that wasn't the biological part because and that's oftentimes the case in the director's job is, the actual biological components are it's based in science. It's pretty straightforward. It's the people part and public expectation that becomes the more challenging parts of it. And so that was with that particular bad winter. I'd never seen anything like that in my lifetime. I've lived here my whole life. Many people had never seen that kind of an impact in one winter. And so a lot of the challenge was to try to create the right expectations for the public about how long are we going to have to wait to see recovery and what things are we going to have to do without at the same time, doing something that just doesn't make a lot of sense. I remember a lot of folks they want to do something, they saw this and they were devastated and they want to do something to try to fix it, like fix it now. And there was a lot of push to do things like feeding, things that didn't make biological sense. And so that was the challenge is trying to manage the public expectation, make sure we were doing the right things on the ground to try to speed up that recovery the best we could. And I think at the end of the day, we navigated through that well, but I won't forget it. It was a challenge for sure.
Well, and your successor now is having to deal with because you left on September 11th of this year. That was your last official day as the director
Mm,
of the Game and Fish Department, and that was before the big fires
yes.
that devastated so much habitat in the northeast and the northwest part of Wyoming. Tell us, I'm sure you're like, oh no, I empathize, and I'm so sorry that you have to go through this. What do you think? What is she going to have to go through and deal with that situation?
Well, I think that the biggest challenge that they're going to face with that particular set of fires is invasive species and things like cheatgrass and ventonata and medusa head. They thrive in disturbed areas. So when fire happens, it actually helps those species become more prevalent. And I know that her and the governor and the rest of the cabinet have been working on and looking at what they're going to do to try to provide the right resources to try to prevent, large outbreaks of additional. We already had a problem before, and now this will exacerbate the problem. But I do know that we were even having some of these meetings with the cabinet before I left to talk about addressing invasive species, and I think that they're on a good path to try to figure out how to provide the resources and do that. The other things that are more short term is just displacement of wildlife into places where they weren't before. I think that potentially for the effects of this fire, from what I've seen, there were some parts that were really hot and will take a lot longer to recover, but much of the area that was burned will recover, within a couple of years. Um, I really hope it does, especially for the benefit of those agricultural producers that were devastated by that. I really empathized with those folks, and with the hundreds of miles of fence they got to rebuild and having to buy a bunch of emergency hay. And so anyway, that it's they've got their work cut out for them, but I think they're on the right path.
I find it so interesting because invasive species, I think of Russian olives, I think of things like that. And so for me, that does not seem like something that would be of a great concern to the Game and Fish Department. That seems like more a BLM and things like that. But obviously, all of that works together. And so you, as the director, and Angie Bruce now as the new director, have to work with all of these various agencies. How was that for you over your career and making those connections and working with all of these state, federal, local agencies? That's something that I don't think a lot of people think about when we think game and fish.
Yeah, and it is a huge part of the job, and actually Angie, a lot of her portfolio before she was the director was to handle a lot of that stuff. She was my deputy, and she handled a lot of the external relationships and interactions with the federal and state agencies, and it is very complex because just by its nature, it's more responsive and quicker when you're interacting with your fellow directors and other state agencies than it is when you're working with the federal government, who has a whole completely different set of rules and sideboards they have to follow, and legal complications that make things difficult for them to make quick on the ground decisions. But and I will tell you that, over time there were certainly, with the federal agencies, there were some frustrations. Recently it's been very well publicized, the frustrations with some of the decisions with the Rock Springs RMP and others. But I will tell you that one of the most rewarding parts of my work in this last several years was working with the Department of Agriculture, U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the NRCS and the Farm Service Agency to do. They saw a need and a willingness to work with Wyoming, and they were really good to work with over this last few years, and we were able to put a lot of good conservation on the ground. They provided a lot of dollars, conservation easements, peat grass work, fence work, and that was a very rewarding experience to work with that particular set of agencies. And over time, at the local level, those federal agencies, I'll take the BLM as an example. We had good relationship with the folks here in Wyoming and with the state director Raymond Archuleta. Um, but it was complicated a lot of times by decisions that were being made outside of Wyoming, and made their jobs and our jobs difficult. And a lot of that, as you know, was well publicized, but it's a big part of the job for sure.
I think that's something that over the years and my, talking with people from your agency and from other federal agencies, we in Wyoming have a great relationship with our local people, with the people that we can see every day, with our local game wardens, with our state representatives, with those things. But it's always when it gets higher up that it becomes more complicated. And so I like the fact that you mentioned that, it's the people here in Wyoming, they're great, but their hands are tied, just like in so many cases yours are when you're waiting for something to come from a federal directive.
That's absolutely right. And the just the RMP process alone is, in Rock Springs, it started, I think, in 97. So that process has been going on or I'm sorry, it didn't start then. They're working on the 97 RMP, and then they started revising it in 2006 or seven, something like that. So that it just takes a long time to get federal policy in place. And I misspoke. I used to work with a gentleman named Raymond Archuleta. Our state director of the BLM is Andrew Archuleta. I apologize for that. So
All right, very good. Good comeback on that one.
yeah.
Perfect. So I want to just real quickly touch on what was the most controversial thing in the last couple of years and just touch on it briefly because it put so much attention on Wyoming from national and international, and that was the Cody Roberts scandal issue in Daniel, Wyoming, and the really ripple effect that that had. How did you, as the director of the Wyoming Game and Fish Department, deal with that? Because you're getting attacked from people who know nothing about what it's like to be here on the ground. And so that, I take that as a pinpoint in time, but also as an overall, how do you deal with that? The ignorance is a harsh word, but it truly is. People just don't know what it's like to live and work with these animals in our backyards.
Well, and the one thing that from the start was difficult, and we identified as something that was important to try to really message early on was that incident was not it didn't have a biological impact. I mean, that was one individual who made some very bad decisions and one individual wolf. The other thing that was important about that, a takeaway is, that was not predator management and it was not hunting. Both of those activities in Wyoming hunting is very well regulated, and predator management, by and large, is executed by professionals and folks who are doing it in ethical ways. And so it was important for us to all work together to message and to make sure we were all on the same page. And we were. We had ranchers in the room, we had federal, or not federal, but we had other state agencies in the room, and we had all interest groups there, hunting organizations, and we all consistently had the same thoughts about the incident. It's very unfortunate, but this is not Wyoming. This is not wildlife management. This is not predator management. And ultimately, it really maintained a lot of persistence in the public eye for a long period of time, which was challenging for sure. But at the end of the day, I think that a lot of folks in Wyoming who chose to did learn a lot from the incident. And I think there's a lot of folks, many outside of Wyoming, that didn't want to learn about it, and still, they just chose to go their own way and to use it as a way to try to advance their own agendas. And so, definitely something that I never thought would blow up quite as big as it did.
Social media
Yeah.
and the reach of that. Yes, absolutely. Well, we all know how well that you and your agents and the other state agencies handle that and the various groups. And so we're grateful for your leadership at that time. So thank you so much for that. Speaking of leadership, I want to shift gears away from game and fish because I think we all associate you, Brian, with the Game and Fish Department. What we don't associate, I think, on the whole, is the fact that you are a Brigadier General with the Wyoming National Guard. And that is huge. But you've done that work quietly. So tell us about your service in the National Guard. You took two tours overseas. You were in Iraq and you were in Kuwait. And tell me about that experience for you and how maybe Wyoming and being from Wyoming was a benefit for you psychologically, emotionally.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was that was a dual career that I wouldn't change a thing about it either. I retired, and I guess it's been 2 or 3 years ago. I can't remember. It's time flies, but I always had that desire to serve in that way, and I loved the mission of the Guard because it was a federal mission and a state mission. You got to help the folks at home, but also stand ready in case that you're called upon to serve federally. And, my whole first half of my career, the Guard did not serve on federal missions. I mean, the Guard largely was absent from Vietnam. And from Vietnam until the desert or the Gulf War in early 90s, there really wasn't any kind of guardsmen just didn't get deployed overseas. And and that really shifted after 9/11. And and it was so I saw that change throughout my career. A lot of folks that I enlisted with never expected to be deployed. And boy, one day we got a call, and it was when I commanded my unit on the first tour. It was a short notice deal. I think we had about 5 weeks and a lot of unknowns. We were headed to Baghdad, Iraq, and at that time it was very volatile. We were being sent on a mission that we had not trained for. We were artillerymen, and they sent us to be security forces and to do convoy security. And the really cool part, it was one of the biggest challenges of my life for sure because of the uncertainty. And unlike other leadership positions, when you're commanding a unit in combat, your decisions each and every day may mean somebody lives or dies. And that weight is tremendous. It's very difficult to even describe. But I was able to go with 180 great Wyoming patriots, and I can tell you that the Wyoming units consistently, and this isn't just by Nesvik's measure, but by others, always performed extremely well. When we showed up there for a unit our size, the average number of wounded in action in a year was 17, and the average number of killed in action was 3. And we didn't lose anybody. We certainly had some wounded, but we didn't lose anybody. We brought everybody home, and I learned a lot that really helped shape my leadership philosophy and the way that I led throughout the rest of my military and game and fish career. At the time, it was very tough and challenging, but I wouldn't change any of that either. Um, those families of those soldiers in my family, they endure a lot. But I think at the end of the day, it makes everybody stronger. Um, it did make the second time I deployed, which was about 4 years later. I will tell you those experiences there um, set me up and more prepared me for the second time. And it wasn't nearly as volatile and it wasn't nearly as uncertain the second time around. I had more responsibility. I commanded a battalion then, so I had 680 soldiers, and they weren't all from Wyoming. I had them from Hawaii and well, all over the country. But um, that actually was, by and large, not as difficult because the theater was more developed and I knew what to expect. And but it all was, an absolute honor to be able to serve the people of Wyoming with Wyoming soldiers and citizens. Um, Absolute honor in my life to be able to do that. So don't regret any of it. It was great. I love to lead, and so when I did get back from that last tour, I continued to serve, and like you said, ultimately ended up being able to be the assistant adjutant general for the state and command the Army National Guard, which was a hell of an opportunity for sure.
That's phenomenal. How long were your deployments, Brian, for both those?
So the first one, I think, was about 15 months total time gone. And the second one was 12 months.
So you all left families at home and they had to deal with those deployments. And how did that shape your family and your relationships with your family?
Yeah, well, I think it made us all a lot stronger. It was definitely challenging. There were hurdles along the way. When I left on the first one, my youngest daughter was 3 weeks old. And so that whole first year of her life, I knew her through video and pictures. And at that time, Skype was the thing, and so occasionally I could get on Skype and see him. But it was definitely challenging for everybody. But at the end of the day, it made everybody stronger too, and really appreciate what we have, and appreciate the country we live in, and appreciate those people that live next to us, in Wyoming.
That's fantastic. We're getting close to the end of our time here. So I want to give you a chance to celebrate. We want to celebrate some of the greatest joys. that you had in your 30-year career with Game and Fish and your 35-year career with the Wyoming National Guard, what were some of the highlights, the things that you carry with you every day that just make everything that you've done worth it?
Yeah, so I think going back a long ways to just the opportunity to work in the field, one of the things that I really found that I was fairly good at early on was being able to protect wintering mule deer, and I had the opportunity to catch a lot of bad guys that were trying to steal Wyoming's wildlife, and I absolutely, those are on a grand scale when you start comparing it to migration policy for the whole state. I mean, it's a much smaller kind of an impact, but um, there was a lot of short-term reward in that to being able to go out and protect those critters that our state people of our state value so much. Um, when you're in a job like that where you're out and about, over the years I had several times where I happened to be in the right place at the right time, and I was able to save somebody's life, and that's something that you don't ever forget. And having the opportunity to work with incredible teams and build incredible teams. The people at Game and Fish are just outstanding people. I can't say enough about that. When I think back, that I think about people and those folks that I got to work with. I loved this whole study of leadership and what makes people tick and how some people lead differently than others. And so I did. I was able to participate in building a couple different leadership development programs, one nationally, one regionally in the West, and then one in Wyoming. And I really enjoyed that work. That was something that you can really see the fruits of your labor from, and it's a long game thing too. But those were definitely some of the things, the migration corridor policy that we ended up being able to get put in place in Wyoming was one of Governor Gordon's highest priorities when he came into office, and we were able to navigate through some very diverse opinions and a lot of different stakeholders, and able to get something in place that is the Wyoming way and has worked really well. That certainly comes as a highlight. The work we did on building all these wildlife crossings in the state. I mean, that's lifetime kind of work. It's really cool to see that stuff happen. That's a lot of fun, and it kind of it mitigates the effects of all those other things that I used to tell people, the problems that land on my desk are the ones that nobody else could solve. And some of them you really don't want to mess with, but you got to. So those are the ones that come to mind, Wendy.
That is fantastic. That's awesome. Two more topics I really want to touch on. Number one, we talked about how when you first joined Game and Fish and you applied for Game and Fish, it was almost impossible to get in to the Game and Fish department. Now there's staff openings all the time. What would you tell people about the joys and encourage people to consider a career with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department?
Yeah, I'll tell you that you're right. Things have definitely changed, and the demographic or um, the way that this generation, the generation that's entering the workforce now, views um, their careers and what they do every day. They view it differently than when I started, and so what I would tell those folks is that this work in wildlife outside it's a long-term endeavor. It is a lot of work, and it's not an 8 to 5 Monday through Friday job, but it is extremely rewarding. And we have, while we've had some challenges this last several years, we have continued to hire some exceptional people. And so the future's bright. Um, there's a pendulum, and I think this too will come back to where it's fully, right now the only challenge, really the biggest challenge in Game and Fish, is with their ability to hire game wardens. Most of the other positions are fairly easy to recruit for. They recruit really good people, but game wardens have been tough. Turnover's been high. There's been a lot of retirements, and so yeah, that's definitely I never thought I would see that in my career because it was so hard and competitive when I started, and then to have to deal with that challenge at the end was a surprise to me.
So That is something we encourage. If you know a young person, if you know a person who's looking for that direction, who loves being outdoors, apply to be a game warden in the Wyoming Game and Fish Department.
Absolutely. The best decision I ever made. It was great, other than deciding to marry my wife.
Okay, hey, that's important. Very good shout out.
Mhm,
Good job.
mhm,
But the other really good decision that you made was to retire when you
mhm.
did. You chose to retire when you did, and it was the right decision for you. And you have an amazing retirement ahead of you. Tell us what's next in your life, Brian.
Yeah, so I've taken this last couple of months to spend a lot of time outside, and that's one thing I really missed when I went into the more policy work. And so I do want to continue to serve. I'm going to continue to serve on the board of directors for the Wildlife Fund. I'm continuing to work on an executive committee for one of the leadership development programs I helped start. And beyond that, I don't know. I'll probably continue to do some stuff. We're going to continue to run our ranching operation here. Um, but other than that, I don't know what I might do. I'll be doing something, but it's probably not going to be living in a hotel 50% of my nights and spending thousands and thousands of miles in a truck every month. So
You get to actually go back to what you loved in the first place, which is being out there in the outdoors and managing wildlife and your ranch. Brian, this has just been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for giving us your time today and for sharing your thoughts with us here on the Roundup. We are grateful for your service, both at the Game and Fish Department and at the Wyoming National Guard. And thanks for giving us your years and good luck for you. Good luck to you.
thank you, Wendy. I sure appreciate the discussion we had here today.
Absolutely. Folks, thank you for tuning in. What a fantastic conversation. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. This has just been a lot of fun. Don't forget Wyoming Business from the Basement podcast from the Wyoming Business Alliance. Check them out as well. But until then, come back and see us next week. If you've missed any of these conversations, you can go back on our YouTube channel. You can go to cowboystatedaily.com. You can find any of these conversations. This is conversation number 49 for the Roundup. So you've got lots of material to go back and see what you've missed. Have a wonderful week. Take care.